Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the show today. I'm Andre Lacey. I'm grateful that you're with us on this Thursday morning. Today, we're talking about Autism Awareness Month. The idea around autism is a very touchy issue for some people because for many families, it's not something that they're comfortable talking about all the time. And so we wanted to take this time to discuss it in detail and to get answers, questions asked by an expert who can really tell us more about this subject in detail and what you may not know about. Joining me today is Dr. Diana Robbins. Dr. Robbins, thank you for being here with me today.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. I'm glad to have you here. When I did my homework, I researched several experts and I came across you and I said, this is the perfect person in my mind to have on the show and share more of what autism awareness really is and why it's so important. So let's dive in. I want to ask you these questions and see what you think about them. So, for those who may not be familiar with autism, can you share with us why it's so important and how it can truly change someone's life?
So, autism is a very interesting um, journey for many people. So, most often, parents start to notice something being a little bit different about their child. And often in the beginning, they're not quite sure where to turn, who to ask for help, what to do. And the underlying issue is that parents want to meet their children's needs. They want to help them not just survive, but thrive. And in order to do so, sometimes you need help from specialists or experts to help you untangle what your child's strengths are and what their challenges are, and how best to support the areas that might be more difficult for them. So, if you think about it, the longer a parent goes, or any person goes, feeling like something's different and they don't quite know what it is, they don't know what to do, they don't know how to help, that can add a lot of stress. Second of all, the longer a person goes without having their needs met, the bigger the gap between that individual and their peers. And so you have more to address the longer the challenges have time to build into bigger challenges and bigger challenges. And so early detection is really critical because you want to start addressing needs before they become big mountains of challenges and when they're smaller differences about the way a child learns or engages or communicates. And then the third most important, the third piece of this that's so important is that our brains are most malleable when we're younger. So we learn through our whole lives. I learn new things today. I'll learn new things when I'm 80. Like we always can learn new things, but babies' brains are really poised to do massive learning. And the older we get, the harder and harder it is, that the more narrow our learning abilities are. And so the earlier you identify autism, the earlier you can start presenting information in a way that that particular child's brain can learn from it and help them kind of build what I call their toolkit. So we all have different ways of communicating. Folks who are neurotypical, folks who are autistic, we all have different ways. So you'll notice I talk with my hands a lot, and you probably can get information from watching my hands while I'm talking. You can get information from watching my facial expressions and even just looking right at my eyes. Those all go along with the words that I'm saying and help me communicate things to you and help you understand things from me. And so, if a child on the autism spectrum isn't picking up all of those signals, the earlier you start teaching different strategies to communicate, the more tools they have in their communication toolkit. And when they get older, they'll be able to choose which tools they prefer. So some autistic people prefer to communicate more in writing and less in spoken language. And that's fine if they've learned how to do those things. They can make the choices for what's the best way for them to communicate or their preferred way to communicate. But if you haven't given them those tools, then they're left with fewer strategies to choose from. And when you can't communicate, imagine how much frustration you would have and how hard it would be to get your needs met if you can't let people know what those needs are. So the earlier you start autism specific intervention, whose goals are to help children learn a whole variety of things, not just communication, the easier it is for their brains to start absorbing more and more of that information. And so the earlier you start, the easier it is for their brains to learn, which then cascades to improved outcomes across just about every domain of functioning for the rest of their lives.
Absolutely. And what you're saying in a way kind of relates to me. Though I don't have autism, I have ADHD. And so growing up, my parents and even educators in my life had to kind of step in and help figure out what was the best tools for me to be able to learn and to be able to interact with others. And so in a way, I totally understand exactly what you mean and how vital it is to have these tools in place. So I want to ask you this as well. What are some of the earliest signs of autism that many parents or educators or even guardians may misinterpret?
Absolutely. One of the things that's challenging is that there is no single medical test to tell you for sure if you have autism or not. It's not like strep throat where they can take a culture or diabetes where they measure something in your body. Autism is behaviorally defined. And so the only way to diagnose it is to examine behavior. And usually with young children, that's done with a combination of looking at the child, playing with the child, interacting directly with the child, and also asking the parents or caregivers lots of questions about what their kiddo is like in all different settings, because they may not be their usual selves in an unfamiliar office with a stranger who's playing with them or talking to them. So the way you define autism is through two domains of symptoms. You're looking for atypical social engagement and social communication. And in young kids, this is often seen as the absence of expected development in social engagement. And so the kinds of early signs that are sometimes hard for caregivers to see are how the child is interested in other children around their age. So, especially when parents work, which most of us do, and our kids are in childcare, we're not there watching how they interact with the other children. And so it may be more difficult for parents to know if their child is very different from other children their age unless they spend a lot of their time with the child in settings where you see other kids. So playgrounds or activity groups like little gyms or little music classes, things like that, um, where you can see if your child is showing the same interest in other kids their age. Um, Another area that's sometimes harder for parents to notice until you point it out and ask them to look for it is how often the child is drawing the parent's attention to things that interest them. So typically developing little children will often get more pleasure out of something if somebody else is sharing in the enjoyment with them. So they want to point out a cool airplane flying in the sky or an interesting bug crawling on the sidewalk or something that just seems interesting for whatever reason. It doesn't actually matter what it is. But typically developing toddlers do a lot of drawing the adult's attention to it by pointing, gesturing, talking if they're already talking, shifting their gaze, like, look at this thing over here to try to get the parent to shift their gaze also. Um, and children who are developing autism are much less likely to do this. They're still interested in the same things. They might think the bug is cool or the airplane is exciting, but they're just focused on the object and not on having somebody else come in and share that with them. And so sometimes parents are really uncertain about how often their child does this until you call their attention to it. And then they go and pay attention to whether their child is doing it or not. So that's the social domain. The second domain of symptoms is what we call restricted, repetitive, and stereotyped behaviors and interests. And this one is also really tricky for caregivers to notice because it's actually very, very healthy. It's part of learning for toddlers to do things very repetitively. If you've ever played peekaboo with a baby or a toddler, you know all you do is you cover and you uncover and you cover and you uncover, and you could do it 100 times and they love it every time. That's because repetition is a really important learning strategy. So, liking repetition doesn't tell you anything about whether a child might be developing autism or not. What you have to pay attention to is whether the repetitive behavior is done in a social context, like peekaboo, or if it's taking the child's attention away from the people so that they're really fixated on picking up an object and dropping an object, picking it up and dropping it, and not the people around them. So even that example is a little tricky. If you have a toddler in a high chair, what do they like to do? Throw their spoon on the floor. You pick it up, they think it's funny, they do it again. But if the reason why they want to keep throwing their spoon on the floor is because it gets your attention, and then when you give it back, you say something to them and you smile at them, that's social. That's healthy repetition. But if all they want to do is pick something up and drop it on their own and they don't want anyone else engaged, what that repetitive behavior is doing is keeping their focus away from people. And people are learning opportunities. Playing with the same toy the same way over and over again is not so much of a learning opportunity. So it's very difficult for parents to understand the nuances that separate healthy repetition that gives toddlers learning opportunities from the kind of autistic repetition that is dampening down learning opportunities. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And I think one of the things that I can sort of remember for me is growing up, I wouldn't say I was a shy kid, but I had a specific group of people that I would interact and play with as a child. And so starting to engage with new people was kind of tricky for me because I don't know if it was a level of intimidation or not feeling that we had anything in common. I'm not sure, but in a way, I get where you're coming from with it and how difficult it can be.
Right.
Um,
So that's an important nuance in the social domain.
okay.
So if you were to judge a child's level of social engagement only in unfamiliar situations with strangers,
Mhm.
you wouldn't be getting a clear picture of how they usually behave. And so it's really important to think about how are they with more familiar settings, more familiar people. So it's totally common for kids to be shy, not want to look at strangers, not want to talk to strangers. Not all, some kids will talk to anybody, but that alone is not an autism sign. But when you start looking at how are they engaging with more familiar people, are they willing to look at them when they're being, when they're talking to them or showing them something? Are they willing to engage when it's a more comfortable setting and it's not such a new, unfamiliar situation? That's when I think it's more important to try to gauge the social engagement.
And see, here's something that I am also curious about, a little tangent here. So let's say a child um outgrows that stage where they're, kind of shy and they're starting to break out and talk to people who are maybe not in their circle, for example. Should parents be concerned about that? I know parents, for the most part, want their children to be around people that they're familiar with and who they can trust. Is that something that parents should be worried about with an autistic child? That they may get
No,
involved with the
that's
wrong crowd,
that's
maybe?
not so common either. I mean,
Okay.
again, there's a huge variety in how comfortable people are. My mom will still tell a story about when I was probably about 3. They took me to Florida to visit my grandparents, and I walked up to strangers on the street and told them my full name, my address in New York City, and that nobody was home because we were here visiting grandma and grandpa, and they were sure that we were gonna come home and find that somebody had robbed us
Uh,
because I told everybody the address of an empty apartment.
right.
So I was not one of those shy kids, apparently. I don't remember. But what you might find is like school age kids who are autistic will maybe have a little more difficulty knowing like where are the lines of like how much information you share with this kind of person versus that kind of person. Um, but clearly not autistic people have to learn the same thing because I had to learn it when I was 3 and I'm not autistic myself. So I wouldn't necessarily worry about it. There's so much variation in shyness and also how and when children outgrow it. That I would say is not a clear signal for or against autism.
Enjoying the show so far? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Alive Podcast Network for just $9.99. The QR code is right here. Now, back to the show. Good to know. That's good to know. So at what age, in your opinion, should parents realistically begin paying attention to the developmental differences of a child who may possibly have autism?
Yep. I will say that autistic symptoms emerge on a highly variable timeline, depending on the child. There, if there's one common theme about autism, it's variability. And there's a saying, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, and you can't necessarily generalize to other autistic people. That being said, I will say that many, many children who are showing more classical, early emerging signs of autism, you can start noticing differences in social engagement around or shortly after the first birthday. That's really young because at this age, most toddlers, they're crawling, they're learning how to walk, are very, very interested in people. So, like I said, trying to draw people's attention to what they're interested in, what they're doing, trying to get involved in what the people around them are doing. So that's when they want a pot and a spoon so that they can stir while somebody's cooking on the stove. And they want a little baby doll in a stroller that they can push around the way they get pushed around when they go out with adults. And so you can start noticing for some kids as early as around that first birthday. I'll say the most common age for professionals to start looking is 18 months. 18 months is the first age at which the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends universal standardized screening for autism. And we can talk more about that later. But even before 18 months, some parents are noticing differences. Um, for language, which is not very predictive of autism, honestly, but it's still one of the most common first concerns of parents whose children are later diagnosed with autism, I would say approaching the second birthday, because kids' early emerging language is too variable when they're closer to 1, but when they're coming up on age 2, if they're not using language at all, that's a good time to talk to your pediatrician or your pediatric nurse practitioner, family doctor, whoever it is, about screening and or referrals for language issues. And if you are concerned about language and social, that's when you should be asking for referrals for an autism evaluation. I want to just point out, though, that lots and lots of kids who later get diagnosed with autism will not show clear symptoms at these early ages. So there's no one age where you can say, okay, it's done. I don't have to think about it anymore. You have to be prepared to notice behaviors for many, many years after this, because some children don't show clear signs of autism until they're older. And this is not because they don't have it and then suddenly they do. It's because the way their brain is developing, the challenges associated with autism can sometimes stay hidden when kids have enough other strengths that they can sort of compensate. They can work around an area of challenge when the demands are lower. So there might be some kids who can do the more basic social engagement when they're 1, 2, 3 years old. But when they're in school and the social demands are higher, they have to be more sophisticated. That's when the symptoms start to emerge. It doesn't mean their brains weren't already developing autism earlier, but their pattern and their balance of challenges and strengths will will sort of dictate when the symptoms are more clearly evident to the people around them or to the person themselves.
Yeah, I find that interesting because I know I have people in my own life who now have children. I'm not a parent myself yet, but I don't think many people think at 18 months, 1 years old, that they should be concerned that your child may possibly have autism and that some of these signs may not even come to them at first glance. So I just want to know if you could share what would you tell young parents who, let's say they just had their first child and they go to their child's wellness checkup? Should they be asking right away to get tested, or is it really waiting until the child is maybe 18 months or a year old to get tested?
Right. So right now there are no definitive tests that will identify autism before kids turn 1 year old. And there have been attempts to look, and there are things in development, but none of them have been sufficiently validated and replicated. So lots of times people will come out with an idea. I'm familiar with there are ideas that brain scans, EEGs, which is electroencephalogram, where you wear a cap measuring brain activity, saliva tests. I heard recently about one from a skin biopsy. There's lots of ideas of things that people hope will differentiate autistic people from not autistic people, but none of them have been sufficiently tested and also replicated. So if one lab says I can do this, I am open-minded but skeptical. I need to see somebody else show the same results before I'll be confident enough to say, okay, this one I think is actually going to make it. And so before age 1, unless you already have another autistic child, in which case your autism likelihood goes up quite a lot, and you also know more about the nuances of what you're looking for, I would say wait for sure until after the first birthday. And most pediatric professionals will not talk to you about autism until 18 months. But if you're really worried at a year, you can take steps without your primary care initiating it to try to address some of the issues. You can do some on your own at home, and you can also call your local early intervention agency and get an evaluation. Parents can initiate that on their own. It does not have to come from a professional.
See, that's the other part that worries me as I transition to my next question is that you don't want to make someone feel like they're a stereotype when it comes to autism, or that um, if their child is autistic rather, that they should be treated differently, or more worried about one child versus the other who may not be autistic. And so that leads to my follow-up question, and that is, what is the difference between a child developing at their own pace versus maybe someone who may be at the point of autism potentially?
Right. So, we already talked about the fact that kids do develop at quite varying paces. So even pretty basic motor milestones, many kids walk around the first birthday, but some kids are walking before. Some kids aren't walking till more like 18 months, and then they learn how to walk and they're fine. Other kids need that physical therapy to learn how to walk. And so somewhere probably in like 15 to 18 month range is when any pediatrician would refer you for physical therapy if your child's not showing any signs, like they're not pulling up and holding on or starting to take steps if you're holding their hands. Like if they're not doing those things, they'll probably refer you to physical therapy. So walking is a little bit easier because it's very easy to assess if a child can walk or does not yet walk. Autism is trickier because those social behaviors, they vary in different settings. They, like I said, they might not be the most evident in a unusual situation with an unfamiliar stranger. Pediatric checkups are a tough time to measure social skills because kids get poked and prodded, they get shots. Like they don't like going to the pediatrician necessarily. So it may not be their like rosiest, most social selves. Um, but there's a big difference from things that develop at their own pace and things that seem to not be developing. So a child who is so deeply focused on objects, especially unusual objects, like not a common toy that kids love to play with, but light switches or doorknobs or a piece of string or things like that, if they're so focused on objects that they're oblivious to the people around them, that's not just developing at a different pace, that's developing differently. And what we want to do for those kids is help them get excited and interested in people because the people are their learning opportunities. So trying to separate out what might just be a little variability in the timing from does it look very, very different? And that's what I would say to focus on. The other thing I'll say is early intervention for autism is play-based. So it doesn't come with the kinds of side effects that, say, certain medications used to treat other conditions might come with side effects. You wouldn't want to administer the medication unless it's really needed. Whereas early intervention for autism is play-based. You're teaching kids communication and social skills through play. There's no harm in it, except for the fact that it is very time intensive and might cost money. So those are the downsides, but you're not going to do anything that's harmful to the child if you introduce some early intervention and it turns out they were just developing a little slower than expected and they're on kind of an expected developmental trajectory.
Join the conversation. Have a story idea, topic, or guest you want featured on Andre the Podcast? Send us a message. We look forward to hearing from you. That was the other thing too. Like, I know just from talking with some of my own peers in school that they would say, well, I remember growing up, my parents said that I wasn't doing this while other people's children that they knew, for example, were doing this. And there was a deep concern. And I can even think about my own self, and some of these instances, not necessarily in a manner of autism, but just my ability to read for the longest time. I did not read on grade level. And so I often wonder now that I'm an adult, that have played in that at all. I'm not even sure, really. And so I want to ask you this as well, because we're running short on time, and I hope to have you back on in the future because there are just so many avenues that we can explore with this. What would you say to parents who are afraid to get their children evaluated? There are so many parents who feel judged or feel that there's a stereotype with getting their child evaluated. What would you say to that?
Right. Unfortunately, we still have a lot of stigma here in the United States about certain diagnoses and certain types of diagnoses. And even though autism is a biological condition, it's about differences in the way the brain develops. It's lumped together with mental health in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of stigma about mental health broadly. Um, I would hope that parents see that the benefits outweigh the hard parts of getting a label. So the idea of using a label like autism isn't to stereotype anyone or necessarily impose limits on what they'll be able to achieve in their lives or what they'll be like as older children or as adults, but rather to point folks in the direction of the best supports and services to meet their needs and help them thrive. So, getting an evaluation won't make autism appear if it's not there, but it will help identify that profile of strengths and challenges so that you can best support and address the challenges. So, autism is not just a disease or a disorder. It explains a lot about a person's whole being. And so the goal isn't to use it like a medical diagnosis like cancer, but rather to help explain the whole profile and then use the supports and services either through the school or the early intervention system or through private therapy to address the challenges that come along with autism, not to squash the positive parts and the strengths of being autistic. So, lots of autistic individuals will use those strong interests to shape their careers. We don't want to squash that. We want to celebrate that. If you're really good at something and really passionate and you want to like zero in and become an expert on this aspect of it, that's an amazing thing and we want to celebrate that. But if you're zoning in on your interest is causing problems, it's causing depression or anxiety or making it difficult for you to stay in school or have a job, that's what we want to help and support. So if you view the evaluation as unlocking like the mysteries of like things you're good at and things that are hard for you, things that you can do without supports and things where if you get the right supports in place, you'll totally blossom, then it might not be as scary. Does that address your question?
Yes, it does. Very well. Very, 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 very good. I'm so glad that you're here because I thought to myself, how can I address this in a manner? I was like, I'm just a journalist. So I am grateful that you are willing to take the time to share this information because I'm sure there are a lot of worried parents. I can even say, not now necessarily, but in the past, that there were a lot of parents who believed that getting their child diagnosed, or not even diagnosed, getting them evaluated was a shortcoming on them, that they had done something wrong. So just you addressing that, I'm sure it means a lot to a lot of parents today. And so I
Right.
want
And
to ask you,
actually, this
go
is a
ahead.
really, really important point.
Mhm.
There's not things that parents are doing or not doing that lead to their child being autistic. There's differences in the way the brain develops. We know that there are a lot of genes that likely contribute to the likelihood of autism versus non-autism. We know that there are some environmental factors like certain kinds of pollutants that we can't control. They're in the environment that increase or decrease the odds of a child developing autism. But there's nothing that the parents do. So, like way back in the 1950s, there was a terrible theory that it was cold parenting, especially moms who didn't love their children enough that made them autistic. Absolute garbage. There's nothing that parents are doing or not doing. And unfortunately, right now, there's a lot of misinformation out there. Um, if a parent takes Tylenol while they're pregnant, like, is that going to cause autism? No, it is not going to cause autism. The research is definitive. Untreated pain is really bad for people, especially pregnant women, because it affects both their own bodies and the developing baby. So untreated pain is a problem, but taking a necessary medication is not going to cause autism. So I would really hope that if parents walk away with one thing from this, it's that they shouldn't be looking back and second guessing, did I do something wrong? Because that's not how this works.
Yes, so you actually got to my final question. I was going to ask you what would be one thing for parents to take away, and I think you brought up an excellent point. There are so many parents, especially back in those times in the 50s and back in the 60s, 70s, for example, that thought that taking medication. And even today, it's scary to think that there is this level of misinformation about something as simple as taking pain medication to relieve um, pain that a parent, like a mother, for example, might have during a pregnancy. So you've been such an informative person on this topic because I didn't even know that this was an issue back then when it came to taking pain medication. I thought that was just something that was going on today.
Well, it's become a very hot topic,
Mm,
this year.
right.
But there have been studies on it for years, so people wondered about it. Back in the 50s, people were not talking about pain medication. Back in the 50s, they were talking about being cold and unloving parents, which was like even worse. Imagine somebody telling you that you were a bad mom and that made your child have a neurodevelopmental condition. Um, that was probably the darkest time, I think, for families of autistic kids. Um, but people have looked at a million possible causal factors because they assumed for a lot of years that if we just find the thing, then we'll figure it out and then we'll understand. And if there are aspects that are preventable, so all of autism, if you look at the whole spectrum, there isn't really a goal to prevent it because autism does come with a lot of strengths and a lot of positives. But the folks who are more severely affected with autism, where they're not able to engage or communicate or even take care of their own basic needs and their safety, that if we can address and minimize those challenges, I think is the goal of just about everybody that you would talk to.
Well, we're running out of time here. I do thank you so much for being here. I hope to have you back on again very soon because you have so much information that we need to know about and that you can share. Thank you so much for being here.
Wonderful. Well, it was a pleasure to talk with you.